We are about halfway through the PTS cycle now, and it's usually pretty safe to assume that at least the majority of what we have right now will be what is going live in Update 37, though there will likely still be a few small tweaks. Over the course of the PTS, I've been gathering feedback from my Discord server, from comments I've seen, and also just putting together some general ideas that I've had myself. Overall, I actually really like where the majority of the game is right now, so this may be a little bit nitpicky, but I just wanted to take some time to give some general feedback over various pain points in combat that I think could be updated or overhauled to improve build diversity and just overall combat enjoyment in ESO. So to start off, let's talk about Empower. This was a really big change in Update 35 that massively improved the viability of heavy attack builds. Instead of a 40% bonus to light and heavy attacks, it was changed to be an 80% bonus only to heavy attacks against monsters. And with that special condition thrown in, now this was a buff meant only for PvE use. Monsters just refers to NPC enemies, though I'd argue that PvPers are the real monsters. I'm just joking, kind of. Anyways, now there are some really good things that came from this. This greatly improved both the floor and the ceiling for heavy attack builds, making that option viable for even some of the harder in-game content. And I want to make it clear before the rest of this that I am happy that this is the case. However, some issues were created with this. So I put together this little chart here to hopefully visually represent the problem that many others and myself have seen with this change. With the ease of use of the heavy attack setups and how well they can perform, there really isn't too much gained with combat mastery with that kind of playstyle. Not that there isn't some, of course there is, but when the majority of the rotation is just a few skills and most of the rest of the time spent heavy attacking, the difference in the floor and the ceiling for this playstyle is just not super spread out. Whereas with the rotation involving the weaving of light attacks and skills at once per second, while the ceiling is a bit higher once you are nearing that mastery level of combat, the floor is also much lower. So this creates a really large gap at the lower combat mastery levels that doesn't meet up until you're really pretty good at the game. And even then, let's say you can get the same amount of damage with both playstyles, well, with one being significantly easier to pull off, for many the choice is rather easy, and especially so if you fall below that mastery level where those meet up. So the choice becomes, do I try and practice and get better and work at eventually getting to the point where I can pass up the heavy attack playstyle, or do I just go with the heavies instead since it offers great results with minimal effort? And again, this is not a knock on those that prefer that playstyle or that need to do that playstyle. I'm really happy that it exists and it can do as well as it does. It isn't just the level of the heavy attack builds that's the issue here. It's the relationship between the two playstyles. People are going to be less and less motivated to work on something more difficult if the light at the end of the tunnel is not visible because the mastery level is just too high to surpass what could be done by holding left click. So I think ZOS has noticed this some as well, as they have made an attempt to buff up the scaling of light attacks for lower stats with this patch. I did a whole video covering the ins and the outs of that, so I won't go too in depth here, but check that one out if you are interested in diving a little deeper into the topic. But essentially at lower stats, you'll see more damage from your light attacks than you used to. So let's give a kind of best case scenario with really low DPS stats. You could see maybe up to a 50% increase in your light attack damage. Now that sounds pretty good, and it is. However, light attacks generally only account for 10% or so of our overall DPS levels. So in that case, it would be about a 5% DPS increase, but that's only if your stats are low. This has nothing to do with how well you are weaving your light attacks or not. So as soon as you get in a trial and there are a few more buffs going, this number is going to drop quite substantially. So my point in bringing this up is I don't think this will have much impact on what we are seeing on this chart here. Maybe a tiny bit on the low end, but not enough to really make a dent in the problem. So the solution I'm proposing, I hope would work a little bit better. The goal is not to nerf the high end of what heavy attack builds can do, but hopefully make light attack builds be a little more appealing across the board and hopefully a little more forgiving as well for those that can't weave super efficiently. So my idea for Empower, while Empower is active, increases the damage of your heavy attacks against monsters by 60%. Yes, this is a nerf, but bear with me. Dealing damage with the light attack increases your damage against monsters by 2% for 10 seconds. This can stack up to 5 times and the duration will refresh on each successfully landed light attack. So a total of 10% overall damage after after you've landed 5 light attacks, and that can be kept up as long as you keep landing a light attack once every 10 seconds. So instead of focusing on boosting the light attacks themselves, we're actually focusing on landing light attacks to boost our overall damage. So streamer comment, I opted for a forgiving 10-second timer on losing the stacks, as it would keep this as a nice boost for those that can and cannot weave efficiently. I lowered the overall heavy attack damage due to heavy attack builds also being able to take advantage of the 10% damage boost by maintaining light attacks once every 10 seconds after the stacks are built. So essentially, if you were in a heavy attack build, you would lose 20% to your heavy attacks, but you'd gain back 10% to those heavies, plus all of your other skills too with that secondary boost. So what I think this, or at least something in this vein, would do is lower the heavy attack floor a tad bit, because there is that new introduced mechanic, and while it isn't a difficult condition, it would still possibly not be maintained well by newer players, but at the same time, this would buff up the power of light attack setups. And what I'm hoping is this would create a bit more even balance between the two, where the high end levels are still roughly in the same relative spot to each other, but the low and middle levels are a bit closer together for the two types of combat. Now, I'm not dead set on any of these specific numbers or anything like that. I think it's just something of this general type of boost that could work really well with this Empower buff. Another thing this would do is also resolve some of these problems that they've been attempting to fix by changing up all the Empower skills to give some new different boosts. So end of the day, I know there's probably a lot of different routes that could be gone with this. I don't really even care if it ends up something similar to what I proposed, but I do think the floor and the middle of the road levels for light and heavy attack setups should be closer together to promote a healthier diversity in playstyles at the non-elite levels of the game. But that's all I have right now on Empower. I know that was quite a lot for the first topic covered, but don't worry, I won't be diving quite as deep into the next ones. So the general structure going forward here will be to just talk about some of the pain points with different areas. Some of these I may have proposed a solution for, others may be just pointing out the pain points. So we'll start off with Necromancers, the Frozen Colossus Ultimate. So I feel like these two morphs just don't feel different enough from one another. Glacial has a stun and Pestilent deals a tiny bit more damage, but I'd love to see these two separated more with different effects. Maybe the Pestilent morph could leave behind an AoE dot or something along those lines. For Blast Bones, really just the Blighted morph that is a pain point right now. It has Major Defile on it, which is rather useless for PvE. So the Stalking morph that not only deals more damage, but it's fire damage, so it gets boosted even more with debuffs like Engulfing Flames and Encratis. So it's just really lopsided right now for PvE purposes. And then finally, some minor bugs. I'm not sure if the skills are actually bugged or if it's just the tooltips, but Mystic, Orb, and Carve, neither of these tooltips are being affected by the Rapid Rot passive that boosts damage over time abilities. Next up are Nightblade's Relentless Focus. So the pain point here for me is that it just doesn't stand out the way that Merciless Resolve does. The extra 20-second duration doesn't seem unique enough. It just really isn't worth it over the extra damage you get from Merciless Resolve. So a possible solution would be to take that Relentless Focus morph in a bit different direction to really make it stand out on its own, possibly convert it to AoE Splash since it does deal lower damage already. Next up is Killer's Blade. The pain point here, it feels too much like a copy-paste of the two-handed skill Executioner. It has the same tooltip, the same scaling. I don't really like that they changed it to be scaling like this personally. I think Nightblades have that cool thing where you hit that 25% health remaining and then you know it's time to spam your Execute, and this scaling has already existed with Executioner and with the Templar Execute and with Whirling Blades and so on. And then another pain point is that it just doesn't stand out enough from Impale given the melee limitations. You can start using it a bit earlier in the fight due to the scaling, but it's a very small bit of extra damage overall comparing it to Impale, but really they're pretty close to even considering that Impale kicks in at 330% damage right off the bat at 25%, and Killer's Blade isn't getting to that point until about 9% health remaining. So I think a good possible solution would be to return to the previous iteration of giving the full execute value once your target is under the 25% health threshold, the way that Impale currently operates, and then keep that execute damage at 400% to offer an extra 70% over Impale's 330, with the trade-off being that it is only usable in melee range. So this would keep the skill feeling like that Nightblade unique execute, but offers a little more power to use in close range. Another fun option could be to have them both at 330%, but Killer's Blade additionally leaves behind an execute scaling dot. So I think both ways could work to give an incentive to go with the melee execute option over the ranged one. All right, let's move on to Sorcerers. Volatile Familiar. The pain point here for me is that the stun is more of a nuisance than a boon for PvE, and it only got worse when the Scamp got an extra stun thrown right in the middle of its pulses in Update 35. So a possible solution would be for it to act more like Arctic Blast, where the stun happens when you cast it, or maybe something different tied to it altogether as a secondary feature. And then for non-pet builds, I think a general buff would be really interesting to promote more build diversity. Maybe something conditional that will only be active if you do not have your pets active. So like the opposite of the Expert Summoner passive. So maybe give up 8% health to get 6% damage when there are no pets active, or something along those lines. Even a small boost would be nice to promote a healthier diversity of DPS playstyles rather than feeling like you're really pigeonholed into the pets. And then something additional to tie into that lightning damage boost they have would be really cool as well. Moving on to Templar, Biting Jabs. The pain point here is the 10-second timer is a bit tedious in certain phases, particularly executes if you are relying on this for your source of major brutality and sorcery. So I think it would be nice for this to get a different buff, maybe put the major brutality and sorcery on a different skill altogether, the one that you would keep up further into execute, and then just put something different altogether on this, or at least bump this one up to 20 seconds instead of 10 seconds. And then I did want to mention, although I don't think the DPS for jabs, both of the morphs, is in a bad spot. I know many have called for them to regain a bit of their lost power. Personally, I enjoy the diversity of choice for spammables now, but it may be something worth revisiting due to the volume of feedback on this. Next up is Nova. The pain point here is the old gray meme. She ain't what she used to be. It just doesn't feel great to use an ultimate for this when major meme is only 10% now instead of the 30% it was before, and there are other easier to acquire non-ultimate sources of this. So a possible solution would be to make it a unique source of damage reduction or some other group benefit that is not easily obtainable. Also extend that timer to 15 seconds up from 10 to get a bit more AoE damage from it. Next up is Solar Barrage. The pain points here, it's a very weak skill for non-heavy attack builds. It's redundant on Oaken Soul heavy attack builds, and the dot's just too weak to not have another useful effect. Now, if something was changed with Empower like we went over earlier, then maybe this would be fine, but without that, comparing it to other similar abilities, Arctic Blast has a stun, a heal, and cracked chilled damage, and then Blood Mist has a really nice heal linked to it as well as the mobility that it offers. So I'd love to see Solar Barrage either get a damage boost or an additional effect added. Moving on to Warden, Scorch, both of the morphs here. The pain point is that they still cannot reliably hit Teleria, the final boss in Dreadcell Reef. There's just something funny going on with the hitbox there, and as this is the strongest ability for Wardens for DPS, it would be really nice if that was resolved. The next here is Northern Storm. The pain points are damage is low in PvE, even by AoE standards. The bear is miles ahead for single target damage, and it's a lot of ultimate spent for a very short duration. So a possible solution would be for it to last 30 seconds instead of 8 seconds, but tick every 2 seconds instead of every 1 second. This increases the damage per cast significantly while keeping the total damage in line with other ultimate AoEs by having the tick frequency. And this would also line it up perfectly with that 300 weapon and spell damage bonus. This skill has such a cool look and feel to it, but it's simply outperformed by other options both for single target and AoE at the moment. So putting it closer to the damage per cast of a Destro ult, paired with those extra buffs that it provides, it would still be less bursty, but it would be better for longer AoE scenarios. And then finally for the Eternal Guardian morph of the Bear Ultimate, the pain point here is that it deals less damage than the Wild Guardian morph and therefore is just not often used. So I think instead of both morphs being damage focused, if the Eternal Guardian morph was more support focused, there would be more instances where it would be useful. Even something outside of the box where maybe it could tie in more with the name and res your allies every so often could be really interesting. I think there's a lot of cool routes you could go with that. And then I did want to point out the sustain pain point as well. Managing sustain seems to be more challenging on a Warden DPS than other classes. Necros just got a really nice boost to their sustain, so something in the Warden passives would be helpful. I've seen suggestions for returning Magicka with Chilled and Stamina with Bleeds or something along those lines, kind of like their own version of Combustion. I think that could be interesting and really play into their kit well. All right, let's move on outside of the classes now to Dual Wield, Steel Tornado. So this is just a really underused morph as the execute damage on Whirling Blades is way more enticing than the extra increased range that Steel Tornado gets. Possible solution, okay, hear me out. Maybe this skill could become a toggle that increases in both strength and cost the longer that it's on. Really give it that like Barbarian Whirlwind feel where you just keep spinning and spinning through everything. Whirling Blades would still probably be preferable for high-end gameplay with the execute damage, and the importance of maintaining other abilities uptimes, but this morph could be really fun, especially for easier enemies that you can just spin through everything along the way and take them out. I think people would really enjoy that kind of playstyle. It's a really fun one that is common in action-based RPGs, but it's just not present right now in ESO. Come on, Zos, this would be awesome. Anyways, next up for werewolves is the Feeding Frenzy synergy. It just got some nice buffs to also add in minor force, but it would be nice if it had a longer duration or if using the synergy affected multiple allies. Minor force is really nice, but 50% max uptime is a bit underwhelming, especially only going to one person at a time. Moving to the Undaunted line, Inner Fire, the 50% synergy chance is just kind of weird to me. It seems outdated in its style. So I think all versions should have a 100% chance to proc this synergy and then replace that 50 to 100% upgrade on Inner Fire with something else a bit more interesting. And then for Shadow Silk, the pain point here is that the payout on the second hit is really unreliable and the damage from it's not quite enough to warrant the long wait. 10 seconds is just a long time to have to wait on a skill to stay in one spot before it pops. Also on the synergy, the can poison condition is a little strange and unclear, kind of like the 50% chance for the Radiate synergy. I just think percent chances, especially unlisted ones, don't feel great when tied into synergies. And then finally with Energy Orb versus Mystic Orb, it would be a really nice quality of life change to have these on separate synergy cooldowns since they are two different functions, one for healing and one for damage. Maybe one could restore the higher resource and the other the lower resource, and then the Templar Spear could be on its own separate cooldown too. It just feels a bit awkward to have all of these sharing the same synergy cooldown when they are different synergies. Oh, and Undaunted ult win. It would be really cool to finally cap off that skill line with an Undaunted ultimate that has some amazing synergy tied to it. Just so many cool routes that Zos could go with this one. And while we're on the topic of synergies, I did just want to point out something about ranged synergies. In general, most all of them feel pretty awkward in PvE as you typically aren't in range of them, even as a ranged DPS. So I don't know if these just need to be adjusted maybe to not require quite as far of a range, or if we should just maybe do away with the idea altogether and just change some of these up to work in more different types of scenarios. So that's the feedback I have for right now. Definitely not a comprehensive list of everything, but just some of the things that I've seen floating around and also some stuff that's been weighing on my mind recently. Like I mentioned earlier in the video, I think overall we're in a pretty good spot. So some of this does feel a little bit nitpicky, but why not keep going with some of these things to clean it all up and make it the best game that it can be. But let me know y'all's thoughts. What are some changes that I missed that you'd love to see for combat in ESO? I do read through all of my comments and I regularly pull stuff that stands out to me for feedback like this. But thank y'all for watching, and thanks to Zos for a really good set of patch notes for update 37. Looking forward to seeing what you guys do in the future. And a shout out to my Patreon supporters and YouTube members. The contributions help a ton to keep the website and YouTube channel going. And a special thanks to Nicholas, Simon, Cougars Bay and the Cougar City Guild, the Order of War Guild, Cantankerous Cat, Shady, Iffy, Blake1816, Mordecai 1212, Santanico, Vidridi, Florian, Phoenix, Nelandia, Unemployed, Criseliana, Cha-Cha, and Technical KO. Thanks again, and I'll see y'all in the next one. Bye.